So today is Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of a new month, the month of Adar, which is the month of Purim. So we're 2 weeks away from Purim, which this year coincides with February 28th. This would be the night of the Purim Megillah reading and festivities, and Purim Day will be, God willing, March 1st. So we started last Shabbat 4 special Shabbats that come. Okay? The first special Shabbat is called Shabbat Shkalim, like the Israeli currency shekel. And what happens on that Shabbat is that it's the Shabbat before the beginning of the month of Adar, of the Purim month. We read a special section from the Torah in addition to the regular annual Torah cycle reading that talks about the donations that every Jew had to give in order to partake in the endeavor of building the sanctuary in the desert. Everybody gave the same amount, which is half a shekel. And it represents the fact that whatever we do with our lives, half of it is the actions that we choose to take or not take. The other half is, comes from God. And secondly, after that, and everybody gave the same amount, half a shekel, which teaches us that the idea is for everybody to bring their best to the table. Some people can contribute a lot of money. Some people are great social organizers. Some people come every morning or every Shabbat to the service. Everybody brings something different to the Torah table. So this was Shabbat Shkalim, which is the Shabbat preceding the month of Adar. So we had it last Shabbat. This Shabbat, since today and tomorrow is already Rosh Chodesh Adar, this Shabbat is known as Shabbat Zachor. Zachor means you shall remember. And in this parashat, we read a paragraph from the book of Deuteronomy in which Hashem commands the Jewish people not to forget that which the Amalekites did to us when we were weary and in a state of fatigue and exhaustion in the desert after we left Egypt. And it's a very thought-provoking formulation. We're going to read this Shabbat. Remember to wipe out the memory of Amalek. Don't forget. Don't forget to wipe out the memory of Amalek. So it's a very curious formulation. Who was Amalek? The Amalekites were the first people who fought with us. And they fought with us after we left Egypt. You find it in parashat Beshalach, the parasha of the splitting of the sea. At the end of the parasha, we read about the fact that the Amalekites attacked us, and Joshua and another guy called Hur were holding Moses' hands up towards heaven, and he inspired the people to defeat the Amalekites. The Amalekites are considered the expression, the exemplification of demonic and monstrous and murderous anti-Semitism. If you like, the Amalekites are like the Nazis of antiquity. They represent the type of anti-Semitism which is completely devoid of any reason except the desire to annihilate and utterly destroy the Jewish people. Right? And that's one of the unique things that happened in the Holocaust. There is a great history of the Jews by the Catholic historian Paul Johnson, a book called The History of the Jews, which is in many ways about the history of Jewish ideas. And he says that what happened in the Holocaust, suddenly the Jews had nothing to negotiate with. Throughout our history, many times we were able to bargain, we will serve the government, we will help you build the economy, we will pay higher taxes. With the Nazis, suddenly we had nothing to bargain with because the Nazis wanted to take our very physical existence away. So the Amalekites are like the prototype of that demonic and murderous anti-Semitism. That's on the political and historical front. On the psychological and spiritual front, the Hasidic masters, the mystics of the modern era, especially a rabbi called, known as Rabbi Yitzchak Levi Mibardichev, says that Amalek represents also the destructive forces from within. Depression, anxiety, despair, self-destructive behavioral patterns, that represents Amalek. And so the word Amalek in Hebrew has the same numerical value, the same gematria as the word Safek, which is doubt. Self-doubt, right? I'm not good anymore. I'm just not good. I'm incorrigible. I'm never going to get beyond these issues. I'm never going to change. I'm just condemned to live in this way with these issues, with these problems. So why do we read this commandment about wiping out the memory of Amalek before Purim on the Shabbat of the beginning of the month of Adar? The answer is that Haman was the descendant of Agag, who was the king of Amalek. And it's a very interesting story that we're going to read in the Haftarah this week in the prophetic reading about how King Saul was the first king of Israel. And King Saul was very tall, by the way. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He was head over shoulders above everybody else. He must have used the shampoo, head and shoulders. And Hashem told King Saul to wipe out the Amalekite camp and also to execute their king and their flocks and possessions. He didn't want the Israelites to enjoy the possessions of such an evil people. No looting, right? No booty. So King Saul had a compassionate, merciful Jewish soul. So he didn't want to execute King Agag. And we're going to read in the Haftarah that the prophet Samuel, not to be confused with Samuel Jackson, came up to King Saul. And you see, this is a good example of the role of the prophet. The role of the prophet is to speak truth to power. King Saul represents political power, and the prophet represents timeless divine truth. So the role of the prophet is to speak truth to power. And basically, we have two kinds of prophets in the Bible. We have prophets of rebuke, like Jeremiah. They're saying, you guys are really going to get it because you're misbehaving, and exile is coming up your way. That's a prophet of rebuke. You better clean up your act or else. The other kind of prophet is a prophet of solace or consolation. And like the last part of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 40 to 66, known in the scholarly world as Deutero-Isaiah, the second Isaiah. So the prophet Samuel comes up to King Saul, and he tears a little piece of his garment, and he says to him, because you didn't heed God's word, Hashem is going to tear the kingdom away from you. And then the prophet Samuel beheads with the sword King Agag himself. So you can think of it a little bit like a story about the political dangers of appeasement. Like in the 1930s, some of the European, the Western powers like Britain and France, they wanted to pacify Nazi Germany. They wanted to avoid war at any price. They sold the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. They thought they could avoid it. And, when I read it, I think about the fact that when you're dealing with radical evil, there's no other way than to wage warfare. Otherwise, the alternative is a threat to civilization as we know it. Let us remember that Adolf Hitler, Yimach Shemo, was imprisoned in the early 1920s because he tried to orchestrate a coup d'etat, a political overthrow in Munich. So they put him in jail for a while, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, I don't know exactly how long. And then he was like on vacation. He sat on his cell and he wrote his book, Mein Kampf, My Battle, replete with all the anti-Semitic filth and all his racist theories. And then they released him. So that's the story of Shabbat Zachor, right? And remembrance is a big thing in Judaism, right? You know, there is a sign in Auschwitz that says, I don't remember who articulated that saying, is, but the one who does not learn from history is bound to live it through again.
Santillana?
Oh, maybe the Spanish philosopher.
Yeah.
And it's very true, right? If you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat your same mistakes. For example, after World War I, the Allies had Germany pay massive reparations to the West, and that brought Germany to collapse. After World War II, there was the Marshall Plan. We actually rebuilt the German economy and turned West Germany into a democratic power. So, you know, and also in our personal lives, we have to learn from our history, personal history, otherwise we're bound to repeat the same mistakes, right?
Is that because patterns repeat themselves, these patterns?
So that's a general question. You know, you're raising a very good question. Are there historical patterns in history? Does history repeat itself? Sometimes. You know, there was a British historian of the Roman Empire called Edward Gibbon. And Gibbon had a very bleak view of human affairs, of civilization, of history. He said, history is the sum total of the follies, atrocities, and misfortunes of mankind. In other words, history is just one terrible thing after another. Another war, another economic crisis, right? But Judaism actually has a different approach. You know, our approach is that ultimately we're heading towards redemption, and that we're moving toward a better time for all of humanity, towards redemptive time. And if you look at the world today and compare it to the way the world was thousands of years ago or centuries ago, or even 7 decades ago when there was two world wars, or even 1989, which is less than 29 years ago, half of Europe wasn't even democratic. So Judaism believes that we are gradually, in faltering steps, making headway to a better world. You know, for the ancient Greeks, life was tragedy. Life is just this endless, vicious cycle, right? Now it's winter, and then it's going to be spring, and it's going to be summer, it's going to be fall again, and you're like stuck on this hamster's wheel. It's the Buddhists call it eternal recurrence. Everything just repeats itself. But in Judaism, we believe that ultimately we're heading towards a better horizon. Our goal is to, you know, make a contribution for the betterment of the human lot. And Paul Johnson, in his book History of the Jews, he says something very beautiful about this Jewish approach, which is the approach of hope, not the approach of tragedy. It's the approach of hope and proactivity. And he says the following. He says that no people taught the world so consistently and over so long a span that history has meaning, right? History is not just one thing after the other. History has meaning, and that humanity has a destiny. What is the destiny? We have 4 words in the Aleinu prayer that we wrap up the service with, which are Letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to fix the world under God's sovereignty. Okay? So,
fix the world
under God's sovereignty. So these are some reflections about parashat, the two of the four special Shabbats, the Shabbat Shkalim of last week, the Shabbat Zachor right before Purim. So Shabbat Zachor is actually the Shabbat immediately preceding Purim, which I believe is 2 Shabbats from now. Then we have on the Shabbat preceding the Shabbat right before we start the month of Nisan. Nisan is the Passover of which holiday? Pesach. So we have, it's called Shabbat HaChodesh. And on that Shabbat, in addition to the regular Torah reading, we read a segment from Parashat Bo, where Hashem gives us the first mitzvah as we leave Egypt. HaChodesh hazeh yelachem rishon lechodshei chodeshim. The month of Nisan will be the first month. And the Shabbat, finally, the Shabbat before, that's
Nisan,
called...
Nisan is our first month?
Yeah, historically Nisan used to be the first month.
Right, and
now it's Tishrei. So imagine like in the Gregorian calendar, if July used to be the first month, but now it's January. That kind of thing. We have another Shabbat called Shabbat Para, which means a heifer, a cow, in which we read about the red cow that was used to defile those who came into contact with the deceased, with the corpse. It's a very enigmatic mitzvot. It's one of the 2 or 3 mitzvot that our sages say it's one of these mitzvot that we cannot fathom. It's very esoteric and obscure and cryptic. Which brings us also to the Torah portion we read last Shabbat, since we didn't have a class. It's called Mishpatim. So there are many ways to divide the mitzvot, right? We can talk about a mitzvot between me and God, what I call the vertical mitzvot, and the mitzvot between one person and another, the horizontal mitzvot. Another way to divide the mitzvot is the passive and the active. The passive mitzvah is don't steal. The active mitzvah is say the Kiddush on Friday night. Okay? So another division that we have is Chukim and Mishpatim. Mishpatim, the name of last Shabbat's parasha, Mishpatim are the universal mitzvot. Don't murder. Any civilized society has the law of don't murder, don't steal. Every civilized society has the mitzvah of don't steal, right? In contradistinction to the Mishpatim, we also have Chukim. Chukim are the uniquely, specifically esoteric, if you like, Jewish mitzvot, like not eating chametz on Passover, right? Not.
That's a mitzvah, or?
Yeah, it is a mitzvah. Yeah,
Really?
It says in the Torah. Yeah, sure.
It's a negative, though. Why would it be a mitzvah?
Well, what I'm saying is that it's a mitzvah that's unique to the Jewish people. You understand what I'm saying?
I'm confused because I relate the word mitzvah to doing something good.
Positive, yeah.
Positive.
So that's because there is a gross misconception in Jewish American circles that a mitzvah is a good deed.
Right.
Like if, somebody would pass by who is in need of money on the street, say a person who has no home or a beggar, and you give him a $20 bill. But a mitzvah is really a commandment. It's not a good deed. A mitzvah is an ethical or spiritual imperative.
Okay.
So, to fast on Yom Kippur is not a good deed. It's a commandment.
But it's also a mitzvah, hypothetically, to fast.
Well, yeah, but but a mitzvah means a commandment.
Commandment. Well,
Right?
This
So,
is something new, frankly.
no, it's very...
Right.
Right.
I had the misconception of...
Yeah, and it's a very important distinction. There's actually a mitzvah to give regular charity. So, even if a person gives $1 a day, he fulfills that mitzvah of giving charity every day.
May I ask you a question regarding mitzvah?
Sure.
So, somebody have told me when somebody asks you for charity, regardless if you feel that you need it or you don't, if he needs it or he doesn't, you still have to give it to him. Is that a fact?
Well, I don't know of a specific Torah source for this, but I will tell you that when I was a rabbinical student once, a woman who was a survivor of the Vilna ghetto. Vilna was a great intellectual Torah circle in pre-Holocaust Europe. They called Vilna the Jerusalem of Lithuania. They printed many Talmuds there, and the Vilna Gaon, who was a great sage in the late 1700s, lived there. So she survived the ghetto there. She came to speak with us, and she told us three things as a survivor. She said, if somebody asks you for money on the street or what have you, always give something. Even give a quarter or give a dime, but give something. The second thing she said is, if we wouldn't have Israel, we wouldn't be able to cross the street. And the third thing that she said is that, she said, we were young people. She said, you are growing up in America, make something of it. You have opportunities that many people, Jews and non-Jews in other parts of the world, don't have. And it always stuck with me, this legacy that she gave us to always, I think it's very healthy for your soul, for my soul, to give. If you give a quarter or what have you, you're not going to change for better or worse that person's condition, but you have empowered yourself with the practice of giving,
The question is sometimes you see, guys bigger, healthier than you,
right?
Hand paneling, and you say, is this a joke? But according to what you're saying, hey, we're not to judge.
Well, first of all, we know that tragically a lot of people in these circumstances, their difficulty is mental much more than physical. It's not a physical thing, right? It's a mental thing. It's an emotional thing. Sometimes a psychiatric thing. Sometimes very harsh, maybe early life traumas. Not everyone, you can't, but in many cases. But the interesting thing about tzedakah is that Judaism, the Torah wants you to transform yourself by the act of giving. So Maimonides poses a question: what's better, to give $100 today, let's say, to cancer research, or to give over 100 days $1 every day? And the answer is to give every day $1, because you are habituating yourself to be a giver. So Judaism is very skeptical, wisely, of whimsical giving. The Spirit moves me today, I'm going to, make a couple $100 donation to some worthy cause. Judaism wants it to be part and parcel of our daily regiment, So, that's something.
Very interesting.
And that's why if you ever see in the morning service or in the afternoon service, during the weekdays, people go around collecting money sometimes for tzedakah, sometimes to maintain the synagogue, and they're doing us a favor because they're giving us an opportunity to give.
My wife, God bless her, she gets I don't know how many different agencies' contributions, and I call her to her attention, hey, don't give to everybody that asks. Give to the ones you choose. Let me do my things. You just give constantly. And I said, it's so great that you're doing that, but why don't you choose the ones and, give a little more to those instead of the ones you don't know about.
Yeah.
But
I hear you.
Once you give to one, they bombard you.
Yeah.
They
No,
just keep coming
frankly,
with the mail every
it's
day.
a joke. Every day, when we pick up the mail, I have like this.
They're all stacked.
Yeah.
Give me
There's There's a story of a couple that survives a plane crash and they're on a desert island, and the wife asks the husband, "Did you make your donation to the United Jewish Appeal this year already?" And he says, "No." He says, "Okay, don't worry, they'll find us." But there's some Kabbalistic views that tzedakah helps balance our iniquities, the places where we mess up. We score some positive points. It helps us balance our our account, and it's spiritual protection. It gives us spiritual protection. So the Mishpatim are the laws that any decent society has. Don't murder, don't steal. That's the name of our parasha, of last week's parasha. The Chukim are the uniquely Jewish laws, like eating kosher, right? That's uniquely Jewish. Not eating meat with dairy, right? That's a uniquely Jewish thing.
How is the Muslims? Do they have the same?
Well, they slaughter their meat in a specific way.
Not
the same way we do, but they have a specific way of slaughtering. But they do mix meat and dairy.
They do?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
If you go to a non-kosher Lebanese restaurant, you'll see on their menu they have, labneh cheese, and they have meat. They don't have meat restaurants and dairy restaurants like we do. We have a descent in parashat Mishpatim of last week from the uplifting culmination of Jewish spirituality, which was 2 weeks ago. We received the 10 Commandments, right? A national revelation. And now in Mishpatim, we're going down suddenly to the most earthly laws. Like if you have an animal and your animal damages somebody else's property, what kind of damages should you pay? Back then we were an agricultural society, so they're talking a lot about oxes, for example. Today you could say if your pet, right? Whatever it is. But the idea is that I think the Torah wants to remind us that to be a good Jew, to be a good person, is not just about the spiritual holiness of coming to synagogue and praying. That's a good 50%, but the 50% is the follow-up outside in the world, right? The way we conduct ourselves ethically in business, we have in this parsha, in the public domain, in the privacy of our families, right? In the workplace, in the social circles. So, Parashat Mishpatim, I believe, has more mitzvot than any other parasha in the Torah. And it starts, actually, with mitzvot that have to do with slavery. And it says that when you acquire a Hebrew slave, a Jewish slave, 6 years he can work for you, and on the 7th year you have to let him go. So slavery was a given in the ancient world. Just like today, not that I'm comparing, God forbid, people have live-ins, right? Some people have live-ins. A nanny or a person who's in charge of upkeeping the house, who lives in the house and takes care. I'm not saying it's the same thing, God forbid, but it's culturally normative for us. For them, slavery was built into the ancient world. It's just the way it is. It was just the way it was. And to remind ourselves, this country rid itself of the madness of slavery only 153 years ago, a century and a half ago, after 1865, after the Civil War. So, so the Torah, in a sense, if you like, started this process where you put in these stipulations to limit slavery. And it says a Jewish slave can work for 6 years, and then on the 7th he has to be set free. And it says that if the slave says, I really like my landlord, and I want to stick around, then there was this kind of walk of shame. You know what I'm talking about? The master, so to speak, would bring him to, it says to God, but Rashi says it was to the court, because the court represents divine justice, and they would, and they would make a little poke an ear in his, a hole in his ear, and he would become a perpetual slave until the 50th year, until the end of the 49th year. And why? Why is it considered a bad thing? Because, we just read about the Exodus from Egypt. God gave us all freedom. God created all of humanity in His image, and God took us from a house of bondage in Egypt. Shame on any one of us if we still want to be slaves. Right?
So what about the part number 7? When a man sells his daughter as a slave, he shall not be freed as a man slave. So is this saying that God wants
could you say
an institution? Slavery is an institution.
Could you give me the verse, please?
Number 7.
Verse 7 on page 359. Verse 7. Should a man, v'chim kol, should a man sell his daughter as a maidservant, she won't come out the way the slaves do. If her master doesn't want to marry her, then lo yimshol lemocho bevigdo va. So he cannot betray her, so to speak, by selling her to a foreign people. But if he wants his son to marry her, then he has to treat her with all the benefits of a protected legal wife, and his son needs to make all the commitments that any Jewish husband does that we have in the Ketubah. So, people used to sell themselves for slavery for a variety of reasons, and one of them was debts. People could not repay debts. So, we say today, if you can't pay the bill in the restaurant, you go wash the dishes at the back. So people would actually pay their debt by going to work for that person. And sometimes they would have their kids work as part of alleviating that debt. This is a very sordid aspect of the social realities, the socioeconomic realities in the ancient Near East.
But is this something that's a decree from God, or is this a man-made institution, or man decides, okay, slavery benefits us in certain ways, and so we're going to formalize it, we're going to canonize it, and put it into the Torah, and so therefore...
Well, but if you look at this, you see that the Torah doesn't say here, you shall own slaves. It says when you have a slave, a given, or a maidservant, this is when you release them. Right? There's a big difference. What the Torah is doing here is limiting the scope of slavery, which was rampant in the ancient world. You can't, in one shot obliterate institutions that for centuries are taken for granted. Even in this country, it's only in the 1960s that finally the civil rights movement won out, and it was the end of segregation in the South and the end of segregations on buses and on water fountains. This is very close to right? Yeah. This is in your lifetime.
Yeah, we had
we had a lot of these, atrocities, all these abominations. So the Torah is saying, here is something that was a given reality in the ancient world. Here's how we limited it: 7 years. If not 7 years, 49 years. A maidservant, if you don't bring her into your family and marry her and give her all her rights and protections, you have to set her free. And it also goes on to say, so that's for Jewish slaves. Jewish slaves have to be released on the 7th year. And a non-Jewish slave is set free, this is in antiquity, if if his if the person who employs that person injures their eye or their tooth. And Rashi mentions then, I think, like 11 or 12 other vital organs. So the Torah was way more advanced than the United States in the 1800s. I mean, have you seen 12 Years a Slave? Have you seen that movie? I mean, slaves were in this country beaten to death and tortured. The Torah says, and Rashi says in his commentary, if you would only, quote unquote, only as much as break one teeth, right, or a toe, then the slave is set free, right?
So you answer my question as far as when you were
Excuse me.
There were such things as Jewish slaves.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, there were Jewish slaves and non-Jewish slaves, and what the Torah tried to do is to set the stage for a gradual abolishment of it. It's something that it took humanity,
So in essence,
way into modern times to stop the sin of slavery.
It was almost part of society.
It was. Right, exactly. And the Torah tried to put a lid on it. For us, it's very troubling. We also have in parashat Mishpatim one of the least understood verses in the entire Torah. It says at some point in the parsha, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? An eye for an eye, people use that a lot idiomatically, right? Tit for tat, revenge, an eye for an eye. But in Judaism, it doesn't mean literally an eye for an eye. It's not like, God forbid, in Saudi Arabia that they cut off the arms of a thief. It's not that idea, God forbid. The idea is that, let's say somebody broke somebody's knee due to negligence or on purpose, and let's say this person is a football player. So you broke that guy's knee, you damaged it for good, that person lost tens of millions of dollars.
Right.
So you have to pay him the worth of his knee, right? Or, what do you call it? Surgery. Somebody who is a surgeon, right? Surgeon. He lost a couple of fingers, he can't do surgery anymore. You have to pay him maybe more than somebody else, right?
For a prosthetic or something.
Right. Even with a prosthetic, you can no longer perform surgeries. Yeah. So that's the idea. It was monetary compensation. Okay?
So there's the oral interpretation.
Exactly. And this is where the oral Torah comes in, the Mishnah and the Talmud, which brings us to the point that there are 3 Talmudic tractates consecrated to parashat Mishpatim. It's full of so much civil law. It's really the parsha Mishpatim of civil law in Judaism, that there are 3 Talmudic tractates: Bava Bata, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Vata. Bava Vata. So there are 3 Bratra. There are 3 Talmudic volumes that deal with all the stipulations here for Jewish civil law and damages law, and discuss it in great detail.
So those are the oral interpretations in the Talmud?
Correct.
We created lawyers.
Sorry?
We created lawyers and suing and so forth.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
As we mean by that is exactly what I mean. Think about it. We created litigation.
Litigation.
Yeah. Interpreters.
Yeah. And there are very interesting things here, like if you have responsibility, if you change something in the public domain, and let's say a hole and somebody fell into that hole, or if somebody breaks into your house, in what situations are you allowed to shoot, and in what situations are you not allowed to shoot?
In any situation, you should shoot.
But
to protect yourself.
So, laws of personal responsibility to the weaker elements of society. The Torah calls it widow, the widow, the stranger, and the orphan. And at some point, it's very beautiful. It says, "Do not deceive the strangers." Right? I remember when I lived in New Jersey, somebody in the area hired some illegal workers. He gave them a job several days, and after they were done, they were like, "You're illegal. I'm not paying you a dime. Get out of here before I call the police." Right? So don't deceive strangers and don't oppress them, because you were strangers in Egypt. Hi, Judith. So in other words, our sojourn in Egypt was a sustained tutorial in empathy, right? We need to have empathy for people who come into the country, newcomers, especially in adverse circumstances, because we have experienced it in our collective history coming out of Egypt, and also in more recent history. The bulk of American Jewry has been here. Only, some people are very recent immigrants, most of our community. Many people came after World War II. So we need to be as sensitive to the plights of others as we are to ourselves. And the Torah goes so far in this parsha of Mishpatim. We're reviewing Mishpatim because we didn't have a class last week. It says, "And you shall know the soul of the stranger." In other words, you should really be able to feel their plights. Because we, in our ancient history and in our more recent history, we have known firsthand what it means to be discriminated against, to be persecuted, to be robbed of your possessions and of your human dignity, and sometimes of your very existence. So these are very uplifting mitzvot that we have. Talks about bribery blinding the eyes of the wise and distorting the words of the righteous. And so
okay, on page 367, line 15. If a man seduces a virgin for whom the bride price has not been paid and lies with her, he must make her his wife by payment of a bride price. What if the woman doesn't...
It's a good question. The answer is that in our tradition, we should be very proud that in our tradition, in contradistinction to some others, you can never force a woman to marry. Never. People can exert pressure, just like today. Let's say this wealthy guy wants to marry this girl, and her father's like, "You ought to marry this guy. He comes from a great family. He has a great profession," right? So psychological pressure, it's always going to be there in some ways, but the woman always has complete autonomy to decide whether she wants to marry that person or not. And we can't, these specific laws are obviously not applicable to today, and their original rationale was to protect women also monetarily, right? So, and unfortunately, in some very closed societies, we still have that problem. In some parts of Islamic society, and I think also in some parts of ultra-Orthodoxy in Judaism. God forbid somebody is raped, sometimes they keep it quiet, because if it comes out that the girl was raped, she might have a hard time finding an eligible groom. So, for us, with our modern, open society sensibilities, it's very foreign to us and somewhat shocking, perhaps even. But, in some circles in antiquity and even today, That's how it is, The point, the common denominator, I think, of these laws is to protect people and to make sure that they are compensated for vile things, right? Just like the NFL player who somebody damaged their knees for good. So an eye for an eye, meaning, you pay that person for the loss of income that they would have incurred. A lot of social justice mitzvot we have don't sway the judgment of the poor, right? So,
and God makes these claims like in I don't have your page, but it's line 23. My anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your.
Where are we? What page?
It's 22, but it's line 23. So that.
What page? I'm sorry.
Page 367.
It's on the same page, 367, on line 23.
367.
Yeah.
Line 23.
Oh, 21. Do not mistreat a widow or an orphan. If you mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will hear their cry. I will then display my anger and kill you by the sword, so that your wives will be widows and this is like...
I really like this. You know why I really like this? Because of the context. It comes in a paragraph. It says, you shall not oppress the stranger. You yourselves were strangers in Egypt. Don't oppress the weak people who have no health care. Right? The widow, the orphan, the stranger, the weakest elements of society, don't oppress them. If you afflict them, they will cry out to me, and I, God, am an empathic God. That's why I expect you to emulate my ways and be an empathic person and an empathic society, so to speak. And a society that degenerates and starts betraying its social responsibility for the weaker, so to speak, segments of society begins to disintegrate. That's how the Roman Empire started disintegrating. That's how a lot of world powers, once they let go of their social networks of support and their responsibility for the well-being of all members of society, that was the end of them. So for me, when I hear this, it's a cosmic cause and effect thing. More than nations maintain morality, morality maintains those nations. You see historically that all the totalitarian or despotic dictatorships eventually crumble, right? Yeah. Eventually. It's just like, why? Because that's how they conduct themselves. They usurp the bulk of the people. And what God is telling us here is that, that kind of society I will destroy. And it just happens all the time in history, Every despotic society is destined to ultimately collapse. You have North Korea now, right? You have the work camps there. You have so many people, undernourished. Well, this regime is not going to exist forever. Just like the Soviet Union didn't exist forever, existed for 72 years too many. So that's how I understand this verse.
So there's no time limit. When God makes a threat or a condition of consequence, there's not a time limit on it.
That's a good point, because if there were a time limit, we would say, okay, we can continue oppressing for 3 more years, because only in the 4th year will God destroy us, to give us an opportunity for tshuva, right? So it's better not to know when retribution is coming.
But ultimately, it's in God's discretion.
Right. One of the most powerful stories we have is the story of Jonah, right? Which we read on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. Mincha of Yom Kippur, we read the book of Jonah. And Jonah was sent to Nineveh, which was in current-day Iraq, a non-Jewish town. And he was told, tell these people that they're really going to get it, unless they're going to change their ways. A non-Jewish place. So God is concerned, invested in the social well-being of every society and of every group of people, right? Otherwise, there are consequences. It's just the way it is throughout all of history. And how beautiful and uplifting it is that we read this on Yom Kippur. We remind ourselves towards the end of Yom Kippur that we also have a global responsibility for the world, right? Not just for our individual selves and our national self. So let's do a little bit of Trumah before we conclude. Page 380 in the Jewish book. Notice that so far, up until Mishpatim, we have been reading the narratives of the Torah, epic narratives, or in simple words, stories. The 12 opening portions of Genesis, stories. And then Shmot Vayera Bo Beshalach Yitro. The opening 5 parashat of Exodus, Shmot, is also stories. So 12 plus 5 is 17. The opening 17 portions of the Torah out of 54 are only stories.
17.
Right? The 18th Torah portion, which was Mishpatim, we just discussed briefly in broad brushstrokes, is already law, right? And not so much narrative. Now this week, in a sense, it continues. Now we are starting the process of building the portable sanctuary in the desert, the Mishkan, that we were schlepping around in our years of wanderings in the desert. So first of all, we're talking about the Mishkan. There are 2 perspectives in this. According to some mystical rabbis, like Nachmanides, who was a Kabbalistic sage in the 1200s, he believed that the Mishkan had an intrinsic purpose, that the sanctuary, the portable sanctuary in the desert, was reflective of spiritual dynamics on high in the divine realm. Others who are more rationally inclined, including Rashi, believe that building the Mishkan was a result of the golden calf farce episode, that God saw, so to speak, and Moses saw, that the people cannot handle completely abstract spirituality. So he said, instead of them worshipping a golden calf or the stock exchange or what have you, let's give them a project that they can create a certain structure in which they will deal with holy rituals and holy acts. Let's give them something tangible to work with. Does that make sense?
I wonder if there's some significance to 18 and the number 18 as the portion that begins laws.
That's very interesting.
Laws and life. Chai.
Yeah, I think it's a very great way to drash it, to expound upon it, because Judaism believes that ultimately what defines us is our actions. You know, the stories are very gratifying, they're very deep. There are so many life lessons and timeless wisdom and perspectives on history. And the laws are much harder to grapple with intellectually. But Judaism really believes that it is that structure, normative structure of the laws of the mitzvot, that really infuses us with holiness. Right? Mm-hmm. So every Shabbat you do this and that. Every Friday you do this and that. And that ultimately molds who you are. We talked earlier about giving tzedakah on a regular basis. So all these things, once they are codified as normatively binding, as Torah law, then once you adhere to these laws and fulfill them, it transforms you. Just sitting and reading wisdom is not going to transform who we are. What really molds our character is the things that we do. Right? So that's a great point, Judith. So we actually, and this is really the last part of the book of Exodus, is a very challenging part. This part, Trumah,
This is
Yeah.
in this week's
Yeah.
parashat.
Trumah in Tetzaveh, of this week Trumah and next week Tetzaveh, talks about God telling Moses, here is how I want you to build the tabernacle, this material, these measurements, very kind of precise and technical even. And in the concluding two parashot, Vayakel and Pikudei, it's Moses telling the people the way God told him to do it. So in a sense, it's reiterated, right? The first, and in between we have parashat Ki Tisa, which also includes the golden calf.
So this is all before, so he's saying, I'm going to give you the pact, and I want you to build the ark, but you haven't got the pact yet, but I'm going to give it to you.
I'm going to give you now the inventory of all the material you need in order to go about. I'm going to tell you, Moses, and Moses, you're going to go and tell the people. And that's where we begin. And the name of the parasha is called Trumah. Trumah means contribution, an offering or a contribution. The psalm that we read before the evening service Arvit on the Shiva home is Psalm 49, which reminds us of something very important, that even though we spend most of our lives making a living because we have to support ourselves, Psalm 49 says, Ki lo v'moto yikach hakol. So when we die, we take nothing with us. We come to this world stripped of any possessions, and that's how we return to the earth. We read in the book of Job. What really stays with you? Your contributions. People are gonna, right? So I hope for all of us we should get to 120, and hopefully people will say about us and everyone we love and care for, this was a helpful person, this was a giving person, this is a person who helped their relatives, this is a person who was engaged in the community, this is a person who gave charity, this is a person who was a good listener, right? Mm-hmm. So Trumah's contribution, it's the only enduring asset that remains of in your possession even after you leave the world. The contributions that you make.
Donations or...
Yeah, but it also means contributions. Monetary and non-monetary. Non-monetary as well. Just as much, probably more in many cases.
Gift? So could Trumah be a
It
gift?
says goodwill. Could be donation or goodwill.
Yeah, there are many ways to... here it's translated as offering in many places. Trumah also means a donation in Hebrew.
Rashi calls it also goodwill.
Goodwill? Mm-hmm. Right, because it's voluntary, right? So Hashem says to Moses, here are my instructions. Talk to the Israelites, let them take an offering from every person, asher yidvenu libo, whom their heart whom their heart moves them to give. You can't force someone to give tzedakah, right? It has to come from you. If a person is called to the teva for an aliyah, you can give or you cannot give. You can give a little. It's up to you. Hashem says, whoever wants to contribute, take it. And it shall include the following. And then he talks about the materials, the gold, the silver, and the copper. And I remembered.
But it's what you're going to take. It's telling us what we should take. Very specific.
Right, and the gold, silver, and copper.
Doesn't sound voluntary.
Sorry?
Doesn't sound voluntary.
Well, that's what we need. It's kind of like if the synagogue says we want to have a day of giving food to Mazon or whatever. Sova. So you can bring cans, mm-hmm. and you can bring X and Y and Z kind of thing. Now yeah, right, exactly. So a specific cause, which is the building of the sanctuary.
Okay.
And he says, I heard from a Hasidic Rabbi of blessed memory earlier this week, I believe, that gold represents those who give just because they want to give. Silver represents those who give because, God forbid, they're sick or somebody they know is sick, so they give in order to feel they're getting more spiritual protection by way of giving. And nechoshet is maybe somebody who just gives because, I don't know, people are expecting him to give or whatever. So there are 3 gradations of giving too.
What's nechoshet?
Nechoshet is copper.
Oh, copper.
Right. Right. And it goes on to detail the various artifacts, right? The wool and the ram skins and the blue processed skins and the acacia wood. The acacia wood is a very interesting thing because there were Hasidim in Europe in the 12th century called the Hasidim of Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz originally meant Germany, just like Sepharad means from Spain, not necessarily from the Middle East. So originally Ashkenaz meant from Germany. So if you were Russian, a Russian Jew, you weren't Ashkenaz because that's German. And the same thing, the word Ashkenaz became an umbrella term for European Jews who are not of the Mediterranean, who are not Italian or Greeks or what have you. Similarly, the word Sephardi became an umbrella term also for Middle Eastern Jews, even though many Middle Eastern Jews, let's say, for example, the Jews of Libya, are not of Spanish ancestry. So Atzei Shittim, they were the Hasidim of Germany in the 12th century, very pious, with a mystical bent, and poor. And many of them had one table at home. And on that table, they ate and said the blessings before and after. On that table, they learned Torah. On that table, they invited guests on Shabbat. So when they would pass away, the table would be reconfigured and they would be buried within their table.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they
I've
were
heard that before,
they
yeah.
were enveloped in their mitzvot that way. The same thing the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, when he passed away in 94, so his Hasidim took his table on which he studied and prayed, and they reconfigured it into a coffin. And that's again the idea of that's what you take with you, right? It's a very powerful thing, right? It's a very powerful gesture.
Rabbi, I always ask, when I'm reading any of these parashat, what's spiritual and what can we gain from?
Yeah.
These instructional parashat of how to build the Mishkan, I can't relate to it in any way.
Not only you. I believe most people, these parshas now, the concluding out of the last 5 portions of Exodus, 4.5, taking aside the golden calf narrative, which is a very powerful and eternally relevant section, it feels very tedious and very technical and overbearing in its detail and technicality. The way I see it is the Torah is like diamonds. Some parshas, you open the page and the diamonds are all over. It's like when you take a metal detector on the beach and you look for diamonds or gold. So some parshas, it's immediately right on the surface, and you can just pick it up. Other parshas, perhaps like these parshas, some of the parshas in Leviticus and Vayikra as well, you have to look under the ground, right? But the answer to your question is verse 8. Verse 8, on page 383, Hashem explains to Moses and to us what is the purpose of everything that we do. Verse 8. Ve'asu li mikdash.
5-8 or what 8?
Page 383.
I know.
Oh, are you asking what? 25:8.
Okay, 25-8.
Ve'asu li mikdash v'shachanti betocham. So get me all this stuff, and the point is, I want them to make for me a temple, a sanctuary, so that I would dwell within them. Notice what's happening here. God is not going to dwell in the walls of the temple. It says, she'll make me a temple and I would dwell within them.
Within the people.
Exactly. So this building was inaugurated in 1981 and cost millions of dollars to acquire it. And at the beginning we used to pray only in the social hall, the Amada hall. We didn't have a sanctuary. Later on, Jeb Levy sponsored for us, God bless him, the third floor with the school. So why did we build a temple? That God will dwell in the temple. God dwells everywhere, in Wilshire Boulevard as much as here. But here, God's presence is more pronounced. Why? Because we created, we labored, we gave of our time and energy and resources in order to build a structure that will bring us close to God. Here, God's presence is more pronounced, more heartfelt. But as we say in the Kedusha, the repetition of the Amidah, Melo chol haaretz kvodo, the entire earth emanates and permeates God's presence. But in certain places, like in Israel, like in Jerusalem, like at the Western Wall, like in the sanctuary on Shabbat, when everybody's praying, God's energy is more pronounced and more intense. So basically, this verse is telling us that most of our lives we spend doing technical things. We buy groceries and we pay our bills and we deal with the maintenance of our homes and we go to work and we Uber and we drive and we fill in the gas. We do all the errands of life. We deal with material stuff. Maybe 90% of the stuff, of the time. But what's the ultimate raison d'être of the Jew? What's the purpose of all this? That we should become a walking, living, breathing sanctuary to serve Hashem. You know, we are instructed, the Shulchan Aruch says in the Halachic codes, to do a hand washing in the Tilat Yadayim in the morning, 3 times on each palm. Why? There are 2 reasons. One is hygienic, one is because sleep is like a state of miniature death. But the third one is that, in antiquity, the Kohanim would wash their hands and feet before they would perform the religious service in the Bet HaMikdash with the offerings. So when we wash our hands, it's kind of like we're saying, we are all Kohanim. All of Israel are Kohanim, and the entire world is a temple. You should do mitzvot wherever you are, in whatever time of day. So, our homes. We invest so much in our home, right? We have to pay the property tax, we have to pay the HOA, we have to pay our bills. There's so many, the groceries. At the end, what's the end purpose of all these things? And the furniture and all this? You shall make me a sanctuary, so I will dwell within them. Our home should also be a sanctuary to Hashem. Our home should be a home where, Torah also happens. That our kitchen should be a kosher kitchen, that the talks that we have at home are positive talks, right? That the idea is that most of life we deal with material things. But when we labor to build for ourselves even a physical home or house for ourselves. But the end goal, and we know that of course, that we work hard more than even to have a house, to have a home, right? It's a different thing, a house and a home. So I think that's what it's saying here. Make sure that you build a home for the divine presence within you, right? So that's a very important teaching. And it's basically telling us, if you look at what you do most of your time, it can be very technical and boring. That's most of our lives. But we have to remember what the end goal is, right? So let's conclude in 5 minutes. Go ahead.
21.
Hold on. I have something before
Okay.
that. Page 11. Verse 11.
Okay.
You should take the ark in which we put the 10 Commandments, and you should cover it with pure gold inside out. Why do you need to cover it inside out? Let's suppose your name is Donald Trump, and you have a dresser at home, and it's pure gold. So it's nice that it's gold outside because people can see. And it's impressive, and some people find it beautiful. But why would you want to also plate in gold inside the drawers? Nobody can see.
Inside, what's more important than what's showing on the outside?
Exactly. That's the idea. That, we are very invested in looking golden from the outside, right? What we do in the world, what we publish on the social media, the way we represent ourselves in the world, we want to look good to others, right? We want to look golden at work, in shul, social circles. But the Torah is saying, make sure that you're also golden inside. Make sure that you're also being good and worthy and honorable and generous and decent when nobody's looking, in the places where nobody can see you, right? It's
And Mark, what was your...
This is the cherubim.
right.
Oh.
That's always kind of a mystery thing. That why have these figures, and that
We're not supposed to be having figures.
line 18. Here's the one you're 18.
Right.
On page 385, 18.
Let me see if I can find a Rashi for us in this.
Oh.
It's a good question. Judith, do you want to...
It says here, make one cherub out of one end, so that you should not mistakenly say that there were two cherubim at each end. It was therefore necessary to explain one cherub out of one end. Well, that doesn't give us... It's from the cover itself, you shall make the cherubim. This is the explanation of you must make them by hammering them, that you not make them separately
I think I see
and
it.
then attach them.
It says here, you shall make the two golden cherubim. You shall make them of hammered work from the two ends of the ark. So Rashi says that they had the features of a child. The cherubim was like these faces, right? These kind of like...
I think Mark's question is we're not supposed to be...
Okay, the next page is the line I was really trying to get, line 22 on the next page, 387.
Okay. I will set my meetings with you there,
Yeah.
and I will speak with you from above the cover,
Yeah.
from between the cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony.
Who is talking to whom here, by the way?
I'm thinking God speaking.
God speaking to Moses?
Very good. He's telling him that's where we meet, at the coffee bean.
Okay.
All right? And the coffee bean is there, that specific location. That's where I'm going to meet you.
I'm going to have my speaker here.
Your question about the cherubim is a good one. I'm sure there are very good mystical sources that make sense of this, because it is like a very perplexing thing, because we're very we're not into icons, right? There's another parashat where God sends these snakes to bite the people in the desert, and then Moses says, if you look at the copper snake as opposed to the real snake, then you will be healed. And the rabbis don't like that at all. It's like, what are these stories about? Like, if you look at a copper snake, so they say, the Mishnah says, as long as they keep their gaze on their Father in heaven, as long as they maintain that wireless connection with Hashem, then they can overcome the challenges from below here in this world. So this could be my homework. I could look for you for some mystical sources who shed light on the cherubim, because it really is a very kind of...
Well, there's like angels, right?
What's the Hebrew?
It's
Is
like
it Malachim, or what do you call these in Hebrew?
Cheruvim.
Oh, it's cheruvim?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to conclude by telling us
here it is, cheruvim.
that there are three main furniture items in the Mishkan. One is the table, on which they put what they call the showbread, lechem hapanim. The other one was the ark in which the 10 Commandments were placed. And the third is the menorah. And these three things...
Say again? Table? I'm sorry?
The table,
No.
the ark with the 10 Commandments inside, that Indiana Jones was looking for that
Right.
ark. Rashi
Did you
says.
find it?
And the menorah.
What
Yeah.
happened to the ark?
And the menorah. So the table represents the material world. The table is the office table. The table is the dinner table. The table represents sustenance. The table represents making a living, putting bread on the table, right?
Yeah.
So we should be godly in the way we deal with the material necessities and challenges of life, the economic material aspect of existence. That should be holy. The light of the menorah can represent what the French philosopher Descartes called in the 1600s la lumière naturelle de la raison, the natural light of reason. So Rashi says, what does it mean that we're created in God's image? It says that we have the ability lehavin u'lehaskil, to understand and to discern. So we should harness our God-given intelligence as the smartest species in the neighborhood, on the planet, for worthy things, for godly things. And the ark represents Torah. And Torah should be something that we engage with practically in the world. It should be in our home, part of our daily reality, not something that is purely intellectual, that that only remains on the ideational realm. Should also come into effect in life. So all of these are some interesting and hopefully empowering aspects of parashat Trumah, which we read this Shabbat.
Describe the menorah.
Sorry?
Would you describe the menorah portion that you said? The menorah,
Mm-hmm.
there's three things, right? The table, the menorah. Oh,
Right.
Table, menorah, and the ark.
yeah, well,
Right.
I got the three, yeah.
Mhm.
But the menorah, the description of purpose of light into the world.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's also
There are many interpretations.
Yeah.
it's also 7 days of creation, right?
Right.
It-
It also represents Kabbalistically 7 divine energies which permeate the material physical world. The Kabbalah speaks about 10 divine energies, or the really 9 in this world. 2 of them are intellectual, and 7 of them are up for grabs here in the material world.
Rabbi, please don't forget your homework.
Yeah, okay, no. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Shabbat shalom, y'all.
Shabbat shalom, friends. Thank you for coming.
You feeling better? You sound still stuffed up.
I didn't mean you couldn't read this.